Hey everybody, welcome back to the Propsmith channel. This is our third video in our prop collecting primer series. And in this video, we're going to talk about prop collecting terminology. Now, we're mostly going to be covering terminology that we didn't cover in the first two parts. So if you want to know all the terminology, be sure to check out those first two parts in this series. Now, in comparison to the last video, this one should be pretty quick because we're just going to go over some major prop terms that you're going to hear throughout the hobby. And it's not by any means an exhaustive list. If you do want an exhaustive list, you can go to the Original Prop blog at originalprop.com. He has a nice lexicon there of literally every word you could possibly ever hear muttered about props and prop replicas. Which leads me to my next point, which is that a lot of these terms that we're going to go over don't have set in stone definitions. Different people sort of have different interpretations of what some of these things mean. For example, Jason DeBoard, the author of the Original Prop blog, has a whole article about how he thinks that production made is a term that shouldn't be interchangeable with original or shouldn't count as a subset of an original prop, making the argument that if a person makes 4 of a particular prop for the production and then makes a couple for himself later on, that would count as a production made prop, but is really a replica and not original. And to me, I think those other 2 that he made weren't production made, they were made for himself. I have an example actually. This Green Lantern ring was made for me by the guy that made the Green Lantern ring for Stargirl, but it wasn't made as part of the production, and so he nor I would never class this as production made. So I still think that production made, when being used honestly, is a subset of original props, and if something is production made, then it's original. That's why, for example, in the last video, I included the term creator made. Made by the same person, not for the production. There's the distinction there. And I bring this up just to make clear that not every collector is going to agree with the way I've defined all of these terms. These are how I define them, and they make sense to me, and I think they're perfectly serviceable definitions. And in some cases, the way I use and define some of these terms is informed by my work in the film industry, bringing those definitions more in line with what you might hear on set, actually working on a show, versus the way a phrase might be used by someone who just knows a lot about movies. Now, with all that out of the way, the first term I want to define is screen matched. Now, a screen matched prop is a screen used prop that has been specifically identified as matching one that's seen on screen. Now, for screen matching to really mean anything, it has to be matching to something that is organic or not really able to be replicated, such as a particular pattern on something organic or specific modeling of paint or the way something is weathered. You know, all of these are sort of organic methods that aren't going to be identical from one to the next if someone is going and making them. As such, you usually don't want to depend on screen matching to determine that something is screen used. While there are exceptions, you're typically going to use screen matching to verify that a prop you already know to be original was in fact used on screen. As I said in the last video, a production-made prop and a screen-used prop are pretty much going to be indistinguishable from one another, unless there's some sort of weathering or damage that can be screen matched. So for example, if you hand me a prop and you say, this prop was used in the movie, you can tell because this paint is scratched in the same place as it is in this screenshot. I'm not going to depend on that scratched paint to verify that this is the same piece that's in that screenshot. But if you bring me something with provenance that I know is made by the production, and I see that scratched paint and I see that scratched paint, then I know that this is probably a production used piece that was screen used and not one that was just sitting on a shelf as a backup. And that brings us to our next phrase, provenance. Provenance is basically proof of where this thing came from. It can track the chain of ownership back to the production. And sometimes provenance is very well documented. A production can have all the documentation showing that this thing was made for this production, and then we officially put it up for auction with these people, and so bought it, and then he sold it to so-and-so, and there's receipts, and it traces all the way back with photos to back up that the piece being talked about in the provenance is the same piece. But in my experience, that's pretty rare. For example, I have a lot of screen-used props. But if I were to try to sell them, I couldn't prove they were screen-used. I might be able to do some screen matching, but that screen matching wouldn't prove that the thing I have is really the thing that's on the screen. It could just prove that I'm really good at mimicking whatever feature I'm calling out as being part of the screen match. So if you're collecting for reasons of like having something that's valuable and resellable and able to be auctioned off later on, then provenance is very important. If you're not concerned about value and resale and you're mainly collecting because you want something that's from that thing, then you might be willing to just trust the source. I have a couple of props that I got from people that I know worked on a production. I know they had access to that thing, and so I trust that it's screen used because I trust those people. Even though I could never prove it in a court of law, I know that thing was screen used. And some props may come with a certificate of authenticity or a letter of authenticity, and that really it doesn't mean a thing. I do graphic design in film, and I can tell you there's not a document in the world that you can't fake. It can have watermarks and holograms and whatever you want, and the fact of the matter is that if someone wants to fake a certificate of authenticity, they can. Never trust a certificate of authenticity. Now, I'm going to have a whole video about how to tell if the prop you're buying is real, and one of the key points is going to be don't trust a certificate of authenticity in almost all cases. A letter of authenticity is sort of an explanation of how a person came by this thing. So, for example, if I were going to sell this cosmic staff from Stargirl, I would write a letter of authenticity stating that I worked on the show, showing some proof that I worked on the show, and stating how I came by the staff. And if I can prove that I worked on the show, then it's going to give a collector a reasonable expectation that what I'm saying is true and that this is in fact from the show. And I can prove that I worked on the show a lot more easily than I can prove that this was used on the show. So the letter of authenticity really just gives the seller a little more credibility. And it's up to the buyer to determine if that credibility translates into believability. For me, I would tend to trust a letter of authenticity before I would trust a certificate of authenticity. Because the letter of authenticity at least links back to someone specific who worked on the show. That is, of course, failing all the other types of provenance that you can get that show where a thing came from. So moving on from the terms that define whether an original prop is real or not, we're going to move on to some other terms. So the next term I want to talk about is off the shelf. In the last video, I discussed a found item prop, and an off the shelf prop is the same thing. It's just a thing that you can buy as is that was used as a prop. Moving on, some props can be either a static prop or a working prop. And I have an example here. Now this term can refer to a replica or an original prop, and in this case, it's a replica. So this would be a working prop. It doesn't fire, but this thing moves, the trigger pulls, the LED lights come on. These are all examples of a working prop. It's moving parts, it's electronics, etc. Now, if I were to have just a solid casting of this that was all painted up and beautiful, but none of these parts moved and there were no electronics, then that would be a static prop. So that leads me into my next terms, which are mold and cast. And they're intertwined. A mold is literally used to make a cast. A mold is usually some sort of silicone that has been poured over an item in order to make a negative impression of it. So then you would pour a material into that mold that would then harden to make a copy of that item. And usually that's going to be like resin, or if you're doing a stunt prop, it'll be a foam or a rubber or some mixture thereof. So if you buy a static resin prop, that's a cast from a mold. Sometimes you'll buy a raw cast, which is just literally unpainted resin that you then have to paint or finish or do whatever you're going to make it actually look like the thing. A lot of kits will come that way, and it's another good way to sort of practice some of the methods that you would use in making props where someone else has done the work to get you started. And then there's recasting, and I'll probably do a whole video on recasting, as it was a straightforward term, but as technology and methodology have expanded over the past however many years, it's become a much more complex topic. But basically that's a term used in the replica collecting community, which means that someone has made a replica of something, and you've gotten that replica and you've just made a mold of it and done a cast of it and are selling those. You're selling recasts. Basically stealing someone else's hard work, all their research. A lot goes into making a really good replica, and for someone to just pour some silicone over it and make resin copies it's pretty much the number one sin in the prop replica community, and there's a lot more ways to do that now, so that will be a deeper topic. And lastly, I want to address the role of the prop master, because a lot of people have a misunderstanding of who the prop master is and what the prop master does. If, for example, you watch any video about Marvel props, everyone will talk about prop master Russell Bobbitt and all the great props he makes. He made the shield and he made the hammer, and he didn't make any of them. Russell Bobbitt doesn't make props. The prop master is the person that runs the property department. I have known one prop master in all the 40 or so productions I've worked on that will actually like get in there and make some stuff in a pinch. But typically the prop master is running a department. The prop master is making sure that props are where they need to be when they need to be. He or she is making sure that props are being manufactured or purchased or rented from wherever they need to be. They may have an assistant to help with that or a buyer, but in almost all cases, the prop master is not making props. And the person that does make the props is also not called a prop maker. Throw that term out. If you're talking about a prop maker, you're talking about the guy in the construction department who's building sets. And the reason for that is one of those things that I have found in the film industry is rooted in the 1920s and 30s film industry and has carried forward. And very few people remember why. What you're looking for is a prop fabricator. Prop fabricators are typically not part of the production. They are independent contractors. For example, Russell Bobbitt would love everyone to think that he made this hammer and this shield. He didn't. His role in the creation of those was to hire freelance or independent prop fabricators. So a prop fabricator can be an individual or a small shop or a big business, but it's not the prop master. And that's just my own personal pet peeve, is prop masters being credited with making all the props. So that's just some of the terminology you're going to need if you want to do prop collecting. There's more out there if you want to look it up, but honestly, it's just there's so much. I don't want to waste an hour of your time just defining things for you. That seems real boring. I mean, it's just me talking to the camera, so that's already pretty boring. So next time, we're going to talk about different types of prop collectors. Tune in for that. Please, you've been to YouTube before. If you're not already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. Hit that bell to get the notifications, as they say. And, check out some of my other videos. I've got some fun ones and more in the pipe. So we'll see you around. Thanks.